Hey, welcome back to God's Love for the Unlovable and Gospel Rant series that we're calling Vagabond Diaries. We're proclaiming the innate love of God for the unlovable, the unloved, and the unlovely. And that's all of us on any given day. If we were just a little bit honest, we could do it verse by verse in Scripture, Old and New Testament. But we're choosing to do it now in this new series through story that are immersed in the gospel, and by the way, informed by neuroscience and attachment theory, but also just philosophy of good story that we picked up from Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, among others. The idea is we want to reach kids today, particularly the 10 to 15. Neuroscience says that's when their brains are really shaping. And if we can load them up with really good stuff, it will make a huge difference in decades to come. C.S. Lewis believed that, Tolkien believed that. There are good stories that are healing, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So, this particular podcast and YouTube is a shameless plug for my first, it's actually an award-winning fantasy for young readers. That's 10 to 15, 10 to 16 years old. And it's very Tolkien-esque, Chronicles-esque. And I want to read a chapter from it so you can see what we're doing. It's filled with humor, it's filled with fun. But as you listen to it, you'll see that it also picks up some elements of the prodigal son parable. And of course, the gospel, the love of the good father. Are you with me? It's called The Tale of the Unlikley Prince, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's a little bit of a long quote, a little chapter. So a little background. Yeled, the Unlikley Prince, is, he's every teenage boy on the planet. And he's convinced, like every teenage boy on the planet, that he needs to do something great, a great quest to prove his worth, his princeness to the king, his enoughness to the people of Garden City, and by the way, to himself, yeah? So the king winks at Nomos, his royal vizier, the one who trained Yeled and all of the skills of slaying dragons and such, and he ordains this quest for Yeled that's ridiculous. It's an impossible quest. There's no way that Yeled is going to succeed. Why? Why would the king give Yeled such a quest? Well, you'll have to read it to find out. But in this chapter, the prince is headed out on his quest along with the royal counselor Noomai. I want you to enjoy, sit back, and again, you'll pick up inklings of the parable of the prodigal son in there. Yeah? Welcome to God's Love for the Unlovable and Gospel Rant. Tale of the Unlikley Prince, Chapter 6, The Great Quest. The excited prince woke up early the next day and put on his serious battle face. No fanfare or pretense. It was time. He was fitted with linen undershirt and pants. Woolen stockings covered his legs and draped down to his pointed closed leather boots. On top of the underclothes was a padded gray doublet to prevent the chain mail from chafing him as he rode his royal stallion and fought his enemies. It could be a long journey to get where the dragons were. The chain mail was polished and shiny, quite substantial, covering most of his arms and stretching down below his waist. The body armor was covered by an impressive red and black surcoat emblazoned with the official coat of arms. On his head, he wore a flexible chain mail coif covering his throat, neck, and top part of his shoulders. His sword, the one the king had given him, was proudly strapped to his side. The prince was indeed ready. He looked very princely, to be sure. With some difficulty, due to the weight of his armor, he mounted his tall, majestic steed and left the great castle with spirit and his head held high. The crowd cheered. The king's royal steward, Noomai, humbly rode alongside the prince on an old gray donkey, at least as old as she was. They were quite a pair, to be sure. The prince had worked very hard, more than most princes, to emotionally prepare himself for this moment. He knew what was required of a successful prince, or so he thought. For 3 years, the royal vizier Nomos taught him the expectations. You remember, princes are expected to, quote, make things whole and, quote, do the right things for others. Oh, there was a third item on the coat of arms. What was it? The prince couldn't remember, which was really too bad. More importantly, at least in his head, he knew how to fight, how to ride a horse, how to defeat dragons, gnomes, and some emotionally misunderstood trolls, and even very large elves. It was not well known, but back then there were some very big and very mean elves. This was no small task. The prince knew how to travel light. He knew how to set up camp, how to cook on an open fire, how to get fruit stains out of a badly soiled carpet, and was even quite skilled at origami. Some say he was as good as Jeremy Schaefer. He didn't expect to need origami, but one never knows. He definitely missed his trainer Nomos more than he imagined he would. The pair journeyed south towards the rugged hill country where there had been reports of dragons rummaging through sheds at night and even absconding with the odd sheep, pig, or bumbleberry pies. The people of the hill country were known for their pies, and dragons are no fools. But given the choice, dragons would still prefer pigs. It's not just the taste, but hey, who doesn't like bacon? Do you know what's better than bacon? More bacon, of course. I digress. But there's more to the matter. Sheep's wool can easily get caught between the dragon's back teeth. They don't floss, and I'll explain in a moment. They hate the feeling of something stuck in between their back molars. I get it. A couple of days out from the presence of the king, the quest went south, metaphorically. They found a dragon or 2 or 3. In fact, a lot. The region was seething with dragons. In a period of 3 days, the prince fought 10 dragons. There were a variety of sizes, colors, and temperaments. It seemed the practice dragons the prince had fought in the castle were generally smaller, slower, and tamer than the ones in the real world. Who knew? This was going to be harder than he thought. As I prepared to tell this story, I researched dragons a lot. Did you know the name dragon comes from the Latin draconum, which coincidentally means dragon? Not so helpful, am I right? It can also refer to their deadly glance. That's a bit more interesting, isn't it? Dragons are universally misunderstood. Most people think they all breathe fire. Actually, very few dragons spew fire. None of the dragons the prince fought did. Fire breathing requires a very high carbohydrate diet with a great deal of oily fats. Most dragons can't afford such a diet. And by far, most of the dragons, at least in this kingdom, didn't breathe fire. They coughed a lot, though. And unfortunately, most of them had very bad breath, horrible, in fact. It should be of little surprise. Remember the issue with sheep? Dragon arms and fingers cannot support flossing, and so food gets stuck between their pointy bicuspids for days or weeks. Yuck. One such halitosis-affected dragon happened to get very close to the prince's face and breathed out all over him. The horrific smell of the dragon's breath stunned the prince. The effluvia caused the prince to faint. For those who are ill-trained in the English language, effluvia refers to the toxic smell of rancid, decaying matter. And a word, yuck. And here's another word, stinky, or pu. You get the general idea. It was so bad the prince had blocked out the event for years. By the time the prince's head cleared, the dragon was long gone. Score 1 for the dragons. One very fast and vocal dragon wore a baseball cap backwards on his bulbous green, scaly head. A little known fact, dragons were into baseball long before humans. There was an entire dragon baseball league with 10 teams, playoffs, and sponsors. The Birmingham Yellow Wings were dominant, 3 championships in 5 years. Lately, though, London Red Scales have been quite a challenge. This dragon was apparently a member of Manchester Funny Looking Feet. They were at the bottom of the league. One wonders if it has something to do with their name. I'll leave it to you to decide. Why baseball? Well, the Dragons attempted soccer, but think about it. 22 dragons running around a grass field with huge claws. It just left the pitch shredded and unusable for the next team. And you could always find a huge single dragon to squat in front of the net, and so who could score? The usual final score was 0-0. It was not much fun to watch. And don't get me started on the dragon basketball tournaments. Yeled struggled to get his mojo going. He chased one of the slower dragons for a while, but it turned out to be a very large turtle dressed up to look like a dragon. And everyone knows turtles are quite insecure. And let's face it, every reptile wants to be a dragon. They are way cool. The aspiring dragon didn't fool Yeled, well, not for long anyway. Yeled shook his head and laughed at himself as the turtle dragon slowly crawled away. Anyway, where was I? By the end of the third day, the dejected prince was a pitiful, rumpled sight. He could only slump in front of his campfire, licking his many wounds. He took the time to review the play-by-play of the quest. So far, 3 of the smaller dragons had bitten and scarred him up pretty badly. He didn't expect them to be so fast and so mean. He also got a nagging, tiny little splinter in his right index finger. Of course, splinters are the worst. Am I right? Fortunately, the royal steward knew first aid. She was an accomplished healer and a bit of an expert in the ancient art of splinter removal. Some can do it well, others, not so much. Still, Yeled was very disappointed in his efforts so far. He had not turned away from the fight, yet it would hardly be called a victory by any measure. He had the external and internal scars to prove it. He didn't want to dwell on it. 5 of the larger, slower dragons got away untouched. 3-day scorecard, Yeled 1, dragons 9. Nowhere near legendary, for sure. One of the dragons he had vanquished didn't put up much of a struggle. He suspected it was quite old and didn't have the wherewithal to fight back. In the end, the defeated dragon limped back into his comfortable cave using an old knobby cane, coughing and wheezing the whole way. Yeled counted this confrontation as a victory, his only one. Pretty sad, really, and questionable according to most quest rules, but who was going to take away this lone semi-highlight from the beat-up Yeled? Yeled hadn't expected to fail, to fall so abysmally short. He had dreamed of this day for months. This quest was supposed to be about his glory and distinction. He needed to prove to everyone and himself that he deserved to be a prince. And yet, even though he had fought to the best of his ability, it wasn't enough. So many things he could have done better, quicker and smarter. He shook his head in disgust and thought back to his training. He didn't remember. Maybe Nomos never taught him this one important little fact about dragon fighting. Dragons are slimy creatures. Everywhere they walk, they leave a greasy trail. Again, who knew? Well, you can guess what happened. The prince found out the hard way. His first dragon was a nasty, very ill-tempered, albeit small, yellow beast with a red breast. The prince chased it into a narrow glade, disappearing into some thick bushes, and unbeknownst to Yeled, the trail abruptly turned sharp left. And if anyone missed the turn, they would plunge off a massive cliff and drop into a tall waterfall. At the very last minute, the dragon zigged and then zagged and then zigged again, avoiding the cliff and sure death. The prince tried to do the same, but stepped on a large patch of yellowish dragon slime. Not only couldn't he stop, but he also found himself accelerating towards the precipice. At the last second, he turned and grabbed some willow branches hanging over the falls, stopping his plunge into the churning rocky waters below. It was an impressive athletic move by the prince. Unfortunately, he lost his princely sword in the process. The king had given him the royal sword on his 15th birthday, and he lost it on his very first day of battle. Could it have gone much worse? It turns out his bravado in the king's court was a bit of an overstatement. He was a pretty good swordsman, yet he found he wasn't as prepared to fight with spear or club. And everyone knows dragons are notoriously difficult to kill with spears or clubs, not to mention bows and arrows. Their skin is too thick, their vital organs way too deep. It had been a very bad 3 days, to be sure. He wondered to himself how he had failed so quickly and so completely. Certainly a real prince would have been better prepared and more skilled than a couple of slimy, overgrown lizards. How could he return to the king and regale him with tales of such little success? How would this record make his father proud? The king's final words kept echoing in his head. My son, all this must be accomplished. Storytellers note, the king actually said, will be accomplished, a very different thing, am I right? Well, there must be no failure, said the king, no veering to the right or to the left, no hesitancy and no disappointment. Any negligence or dereliction in the quest would be consequential. Is that clear? Well, I'm no doctor, but I suspect the prince was becoming quite despondent. True, he did not act like a prince of any distinction. He did not feel like one and was riddled with sadness. The king will be so disappointed in me, Yeled thought to himself. Some smart individual invented the word bleak just for this situation. The prince was immersed in shame and self-condemnation. By the way, we all know what shame feels like when you mess up so often. You begin to think something's wrong with you. You wonder if you're broken somehow. Are you good enough for people to like you or think about you at all? You look in the mirror and wonder if you're strong enough, smart enough, pretty enough, funny enough, likable enough, thin enough, or in Yeled's case, princely enough. Not enoughness can be a real problem for people like the prince and you and me, of course. Not enoughness can make even princes and princesses very sad. So where was I? Oh yes, of course. The prince was not in a good space. He did not do princeliness well, not up to his own expectations, and he thought not up to the high standards of his king. Surely the king will be disappointed, maybe even disgusted with my puny efforts, the prince complained to himself. How can I ever look up into the gaze of my father again after this total collapse of princeliness? I can't. How can I wear this coat of arms again? Wait, he exclaimed, the coat of arms! The 3 things, I've forgotten them. I can still do them. I should do them, and they will make all of this mess a success. Okay, all right, let me see. Mishpat. I am to be about making others' situations whole again. I'm to look for injustices needing to be made right. I'm not sure what justice has to do with slaying dragons. Maybe the next one. Tzedakah, restoring others to rightness. Yeah, setting prisoners free, that sort of thing. Again, just not a dragon-slaying thing, really? Lipnei Melech, the presence of the king. How do I be in 2 places at the same time? The kingdom is a long way away now. How can I be in the presence of the king out here? What's the point? Maybe these will be made clearer tomorrow. He could only shake his head in confusion. The wonderful coat of arms was of little help, really. The prince, once filled with confidence, was now not sure what to do. The quest had not started well. Okay, it was a bust, but maybe tomorrow. He hoped, but wasn't sure. The next day was even darker and more overcast. Apologies for the easy weather metaphor. There was a deep biting chill in the air. Second apology, please forgive me. This was a very good time for the royal steward to speak to Yeled, and so she drew close to him, pulled back her hood, and looked directly into the beat-up prince's eyes. Prince, please hear me, the gentlewoman implored. Look into my eyes. Indeed, you have suffered great losses in these early days. You have also worked very hard. My encouragement is for you to remember the king's love for you. He does not love you because you are worthy of his love. His love doesn't require worthiness. It makes you worthy. He can't love you any more than he did when you left for this quest, and he can't and won't love you any less. Remember looking up into his eyes just before you left? Hold on to that. Events change out here. There are successes and failures, and often they look and feel the same, but your relationship with the king is forever. He is proud of you. Prince Yeled, remember. Unfortunately, the prince stopped listening right after Please Hear Me. And no judgment from me, I've been there. Your self-focused brain doesn't allow you to hear from anyone else. You're not being rude, you're just being human. All the prince could think about was how poor a prince he had been. He had been bullied by a couple of stupid, overgrown reptiles. No disrespect to smart dragons out there. I'm just reporting what the prince's wounded brain was saying. Now, everyone could clearly see he was not worthy, not enough to be the king's son. All he could think about was the shame he had brought upon his stepfather's name. He had now failed 2 fathers in only 3 years. He wondered if it was some sort of kingdom record. For this astute audience, you may have noticed the prince thought of the great king as his stepfather for the very first time. While accurate, I suspect other emotions were at play here. What do you think? The now increasingly depressed prince began to worry whether he could ever go home again. It would be too painful to see the disappointment in his father's measuring gaze. His only hope was to press on while clinging to a feather-thin chance of things changing. But even he didn't believe that would happen. Maybe, just maybe, he could salvage a little of his reputation of doing princely, a little bit anyway. He had to. The quest had lost all joy for him. He looked back over his shoulder in the direction of the castle. He thought he could barely see it just over the horizon, through the narrow valley. It seemed so far away now. He could only walk further away from the Lipnei Melech, the presence of the king. The prince's head hung low, his steps heavy. The royal steward knew there was nothing she could say. Not yet. Surely it couldn't get worse. But then, the end. So, here's some dialogue starters I thought about. And again, this is after you go and buy the book, either on Amazon, Kindle, or Audible, and buy them for all the 10 to 15-year-olds in your life and your church. So why would the good king give such a difficult quest to someone he loves? Right? Second, in most quest tales, the prince would go out, fail a few times, learn some magic formula, some mantra, or get some new weapon, and then be successful with all these new life lessons or magic. So what kind of quest is it that the prince is designed to fail? Third, so tell me about this love of the king. Think about it. And lastly, well, not quite lastly, second to last, what do you think the royal steward Noomai was trying to tell the prince? And lastly, can you relate to such a quest? If you like this Vagabond Diary, please like and subscribe and forward it to a friend. If you like this particular chapter, or your 10 to 15-year-old did, get the entire set on Kindle, Amazon, and Barnes & Noble. There's 3 Kingdom Quest books. You can find them at drbillsenior.com, Audible, Barnes & Noble, and Kindle. Check it out. All right? We'll see you next time on Vagabond Tales. Take heart, child of God.